So, without further ado, as they say, this is one of a handful of talks that we've arranged so far, and I'm very pleased to welcome Bill, who is over the hill in Glossop by the magic of technology, has spent a lot of his life in Mossley, and he's going to give us a talk, and I'll read out the title. I need to look at my notes, and it is Mossley's Rapid Rise and Long Decline as a Textile Manufacturing Centre. Over to you, Bill.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for your interest. Thanks for showing up. I know a few faces there. We've all got a bit older since I last saw. Well, I suppose I have as well. But
less hair.
Yeah.
Speak for yourself.
Well, it's nice to see some old faces anyway. Just a word about me. I was born in Manchester quite some years ago now, in a place called Newton Heath, which is East Manchester, which was on the edge of Manchester's industrial area. I was in Newton Heath until my early 20s when I moved on. But in the time I was there, my father was an engineer. My mother worked in a cotton mill. My grandmothers both worked in cotton mills, and they were. I was born many years later, but when they'd been working in cotton mills, but they actually worked in Ancoats cotton mills in Manchester, which, as this presentation goes on, was the seat of the Industrial Revolution and the cotton textile industry across southeast Lancashire. My mother worked in Jersey Mill on Jersey Street in Ancoats, which is still there, but it's called the Northern Quarter now. And who can afford to live there? I can't. As I say, my father was an engineer. Aunts and uncles and extended family, they were either in engineering, coal mining, or they worked on the railways. So my roots lie very deeply deeply entrenched in the basic industries that were born of the Industrial Revolution. Moving on quickly, sorry about this, I ramble on somewhat. Moving on, living in that part of the world and being quite adventurous as to where I travelled on foot with my mates, we'd often come across old mills, old railway sidings, old buildings that were built and used during the 1900s and the mid to late 1800s. Many of them were derelict, and the canals were pretty much been disused since the end of the Second War. But we're kind of drawn to this. One, it was a great place to play. But secondly, it was an experience that kind of stayed with me for much of my life. And by the 1970s, I was actually working in Ancoats. I was there for many years. And again, a lot of the buildings were still there. The old mills, the canals were still there. They weren't used, obviously, but they were in a mess. But I'm going around the long way to say that my interest in history in the Manchester region was really born unwittingly at a fairly early time in my life when I saw the last vestiges of the Industrial Revolution and the buildings that it took place in. And when I went on to uni as a mature student, not that many years ago, I think it's 10 years, I chose Manchester Regional History as my subject. And I wrote about, guess what? The Industrial Revolution and the cotton industry, engineering. And when I moved to Mossley in 1983, I found the same thing in Mossley that I'd seen in Manchester many years before, and that was all the derelict mills on the valley floor of the Tame Valley running through Mossley. And I was absolutely taken with it. I used to walk my dog around there, and I go in the old mills. They were as unsafe as I don't know what. I mean, risking life and limb really. But the size of them, it absolutely intrigued me, and took me back many years to my youth. And I started reading about them in a book called Mossley Textile Mills, which is still in print, written by a chap called Ian Haynes. I read that from cover to cover on a number of occasions, and actually went around some of the mills now derelict that he named in the book. And I started reading more and more about Mossley's history from the bottom up, as I've explained to Jane. I mean, it's great to look at the great historians, but they tend to write from the top down. The working man, working woman, and the children are often left out because of the good and the great tend to rule the roost long after the death, such as John Mayall, who not John Mayall's Blues Breakers, I might add. It was John Mayall, the millionaire industrialist in Mossley. But I understand John Mayall, the musician, is related to John Mayall, the industrialist. I don't know how true it is. Throw it in. So yeah, I started reading about Mossley's history, which is why I'm sitting here this evening. What I've done is it's such a vast subject that I've had some difficulty trying to contain it, but I hope I've succeeded. What I propose to do is you can't look at Mossley without looking at southeast Lancashire, without looking at Manchester, without looking at Lancashire as a whole, and without looking at the world picture during the 1700s. So in 2 pages, I'm going to go from 1500 to about 1750. So I'm going to read this from a screen. You can probably see the light of it coming in from this direction, but I couldn't possibly remember all this with any degree of accuracy. So my apologies. I'll be looking at the screen and reading from it. So Mossley's rapid rise and long decline as a cotton textile manufacturing centre. I've put 4 categories here. When? Well, it was the first quarter of the 1800s for Mossley. Where? Top Mossley, believe it or not. How? Obviously, the Industrial Revolution, steam power, and purpose-built cotton mills. And then the big question, why? And it was an investment by local entrepreneurs following 1815, which you'll remember concluded with the Battle of Waterloo and opened up trade to Western Europe, basically. So what happened? Going back in time, traditionally woolen and linen textile manufacturing had been Britain's key textile industries. You're gonna know some of this from school. The memories are gonna come rushing back and not having done your homework. In the north of the country, Manchester was already known as a regional market centre for fustians and linen cloth. Fustians, a mix of cotton and linen. I'm sure the people who deal with textiles amongst your group will correct me if I say anything wrong about textiles and what have you. But Manchester was known for fustians and linen cloth. It was a township, Manchester, but lots of people say I'm going into town. Mancunians say I'm going into town, which means you're going into the city centre. It's just one of those things, and it stems from when Manchester was a township. And it was a town of textile warehouses, not of industry. It was a town of textile warehouses, and it was the home of an established textile merchant business who'd formed links with London since the 1500s. So it was well respected, the township of Manchester, for its merchants, and they played a great role, as you might imagine, in the development of the cotton textile trade. The Manchester merchants, which was their official title, if you like, the ones in Liverpool were Liverpool gentlemen, and there was a lot of animosity between the two, although it was good-natured most of the time. So the Manchester merchants they distributed the raw material out to regional rural areas under the putting out system. Has anybody heard of that previously? Putting out system. What it was is the merchants had the raw material. They wanted, for want of a better word, agents who were the poor farmers surrounding the township of Manchester, the poor farmers of Didsbury and Fallowfield and places such as that. I don't think there's many poor farmers in Didsbury or Wilmslow these days, but they once were rural areas. They put out the raw material with instructions to these people on these little farmsteads to spin or weave whatever the merchants wanted, and that was what we will all know as being the domestic system of manufacture. Because our agriculture is such an uncertain occupation, it's certainly seasonal in this period we're talking about. Many farmers became totally dependent on the putting out system and became little better than subcontractors to the Manchester merchants. And by the 1600s, Manchester was already gaining a great reputation for wealth and the creation of wealth because of the Manchester merchants. Now, notwithstanding Manchester's reputation as an established merchant base and a rising finance centre, it stood slap bang in the middle of Lancashire County, more or less, which remarkably was considered one of the poorest counties in Britain. And it was even described in the Domesday Book as being waste, W-A-S-T-E, which means it wasn't useless in the those terms. It was just nothing there, just moorland, basically, of little use other than for grazing sheep. So it didn't have a great deal going for it. However, that would change dramatically in a relatively short space of time. So since the 1600s, the demand for cotton goods in Britain slowly increased because of importation of pure cotton from India and also China. Long established trades, far before Lancashire even got a sniff of cotton. India had been producing extremely fine cotton goods for many hundreds of years. And it was thanks to, no, I retract that, retract the thanks. It was the British East India Company who were really responsible for getting the cotton goods out to Britain and other parts of Western Europe. And they made quite a lot of money from it. The reason for cotton's importance was and popularity was that it was comfortable and far lighter than the traditional wool or leather clothing that people in Western Europe and Britain in particular were wearing, especially in summer, because the woolen and fustian stuff, it was itchy. I mean, if you wear a woolly hat in winter, certainly in my case, I mean, if you got a good head of hair, it won't apply. But in my case, I would put a woolly hat on and my head starts itching within an hour. And it must have been similar to wearing woolen garments all those years ago. So as I say, the Indian textile manufacturing industry was centuries old and countrywide, but it was a wee bit disjointed. It was working on the domestic, its own domestic system. Now, there was a chap came along called Robert Clive, who you may remember as Clive of India from your history lessons. He became the first governor of India, but prior to that, he made his name as an army officer in the East India Company. Essentially, Clive was not the hero he was portrayed when I was at school a number of years ago. He was looked upon as something of a cult figure, if you like, by historians, unfortunately. What he was an asset stripper. He used bribery and corruption to gain what he wanted. He opened the door to India through the East India Company and allowed the British Empire in. Clive, the British East India Company and the British Empire were, at that time, and remained racist and expansionist forces, taking land by force where necessary, in this case India. And the British East India Company was a key mover in slavery for over 200 years, until Britain had the clout to disband it, but that was only in the 1800s. So that kind of sets the scene, really. And I think from that, you got the impression that India was and China, but India in particular, was the biggest manufacturer of good quality textile goods in the world, quite honestly. So in Britain in the 1700s, if the merchants and the Manchester merchants had the ears of the London merchants and the port authorities through which they traded, it was the manufacturers who had the ears of the politicians and the English aristocracy who had the wealth. The British manufacturers had to curb the Indian textile trade to protect the English. When we talk about Britain in this period, I'm not being unkind to anybody. You are talking about England. So the Indian cotton textile trade had to be protected, and the whole market essentially was England. By the mid 1700s, the wealthy and powerful English wool manufacturers of Yorkshire had lobbied Parliament to ban imported textile goods into Britain, primarily India, China, but also other countries in the Middle East as well. So there's a complete ban on their goods coming in. The Lancashire textile manufacturers saw and appreciated what was going on, and they developed fustian as an alternative to the better quality Indian goods that were now not coming into the country. And they did this despite Lancashire County's economic backwardness. They managed to find the finance to achieve this. So they were exporting cheaper textiles to flood the Indian market. Higher taxes were levied against Indian goods coming into Britain, what few got through. And the British goods, the Lancashire fustians, if you like, being exported to India via the East India Company, paid far less tax, if they paid any at all. So in effect, what Britain had done, it had imposed protectionist measures in order to restrict imports from India, while forcing the Indian market open to British goods. And British colonial rule in India helped to cement Britain's monopoly over the cotton producing market, contributing to the continually growing commercial success of the East India Company and the British Empire. And I'm going to have to get a glass of water. Can I be excused for a moment? I do apologise. I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
Not really drinking water, you know.
I know. Neither am I. I've got my cocoa at the moment.
It's a bit early for that.
Anybody else drinking? Just interested. Come on, Chris, what are you drinking?
I had a cup of coffee before, but I ain't got anything at the moment.
No, that's right, boring.
I've got a very Chiltern glass of water with mint and cucumber.
Oh, say. I've got Yorkshire tea.
Yorkshire tea.
This has got rhubarb.
From Yorkshire.
Well, there is the rhubarb triangle in Yorkshire, isn't there?
Sorry about that.
Are you back? Are you lubricated?
Yeah, it's not gin. Not yet.
Right, I'll turn my mic off.
Right, so I'm sorry about that. So Britain imposed protectionist measures through Parliament at the whim of the British manufacturers. Now in 1600, when the East India Company was founded, this is how successful this attack which is the word, that is the word, this attack on the Indian textile manufacturing industry. When the East India Company was founded, Britain was generating 1.8% of the world's gross domestic product. India was producing 22.5%. But you can, from that, you know, just the figures alone, you can see Britain was way behind and India was far in front. By the peak of the British Raj in India, which was round about the middle of the 19th century, shall we say, for ease of reference, India had been reduced, its textile manufacturing had been reduced, and the country to a symbol of famine and deprivation. That's thanks to the Brits. A chap called Ernest Jones, who was a leading chartist and a journalist of the chartist paper, the Northern Star, described the British Empire, and I've got to agree, and I can't disagree, as being the empire on which the sun never set and the blood never dried. And that's been used by a number of people over the years, not least Irish nationalists. And you can understand, you know, if you've got an idea of what went on over there, yeah, it would be a phrase that they would be only too familiar with. And you can't say they're wrong, can you? So it's the empire on which the sun never set and the blood never dried. So if we use 1750 as the starting date for the British Industrial Revolution, why was it then? Why was it 1750? Why was it in England? Why was it Southeast Lancashire? Why was it centred on Manchester, and how did it affect Mossley? So you see the chain of command coming through. And I'm going to touch on all those things. Right. So as early as 1750, the British were gaining fame for the invention of machinery and the quality of British workmanship. One of the examples of British inventiveness was a machine based at a Newcastle coal mine, and it could raise 580 tons of floodwater from a mine shaft to a height of 180 feet. And at that particular moment in time, it was staggering for the period. And the British had the know-how to do it. Nobody else did at that time. And it signalled the age of the steam engine, albeit in a primitive form, but that was only to be for a short time because it was improved and became exceptionally successful. So trying to explain the origin of the Industrial Revolution is no easy task. Social commentators and historians have been researching the same question since the mid-1800s. And that was when it was first recognised that an industrial revolution had actually taken place in Britain, albeit 100 years earlier. It's like our technological revolution. I mean, I'm fully aware of it now, as we all are. But did you really see it coming? You know, there was Super Mario was coming in and things like that, wasn't it? And of course, far more advanced than Super Mario stuff. But it kind of crept up on me for sure. Now I might be showing my age here, but if you look at the Industrial Revolution in the same way as we look at the technological revolution we've experienced, it gives you some idea really of what people, well, it crept up on lots of people, to put it crudely, bluntly. So where did it start? So cast your mind back, 1750, where did it start? Was it in London? It was arguably the greatest European city by the 1700s. Forward-thinking, home to some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the land. And of course, London was twice the size of Paris at this particular time. But no, it wasn't London. Outside London, Liverpool was expanding at a rapid rate, as were Bristol and Glasgow. Each had established ports, partly based on the slave trade and partly based on trading in colonial imports, such as tea, sugar, and tobacco. So they had a good foundation, perhaps, for a a good place where the Industrial Revolution could have started. Similar terrain to Lancashire, moorland, fields, lots of water, very wet. But no, it was none of them. So you might think, well, Birmingham has a reputation for being an industrial heart, and in the 1700s, it was very well established, and had been since the 1500s. And they actually made the weapons for the English Civil War. They made them for Cromwell, and they made them for King Charles. So don't trust a Brummie. Nobody's a Brummie, by the way, are they? I heard laughter and one or two heads. No, I'm looking for the one that goes like that, actually.
By extension, I am. My family are all Brummies.
There's always one, isn't there? There's always one goes and ruins it. No disrespect, my best mate's from Brummie as well.
Didn't they invent cuppa soups in Birmingham?
The what, sorry?
Didn't they invent cuppa soups? That's a joke.
Quite likely, yeah. Yeah, quite likely.
Vic Reed's joke.
So by the 1700s, London, if London was the greatest city, Birmingham was the greatest industrial centre, and there's absolutely no denying that was the case. But there was a problem. Although some of its factories were operated by steam power, by the 1790s there were still thousands of small, medium and large independent workshops employing numbers of workers to produce metal and iron goods individually and by hand. The problem was its manufacturers weren't applying steam technology to operate presses, lathes and other available machinery under a factory system and a capitalist system. The Birmingham manufacturers were slow to make the transition to steam power, yet the technology had been available from 1775, but as late as 1815, there were only 40 steam engines in use across the Birmingham region. In other words, Birmingham lost the initiative. There was no mass production in operation employing steam power to produce goods using privately owned and controlled production methods based on the laws of supply and demand. So, to put it crudely, they missed the bus. Having said that, Birmingham still remained a significant industrial centre, and the town was producing far more in 1850 than it had been in 1750, but its manufacturers were operating in the old way. So no, it didn't happen in Birmingham. It happened in Manchester, of course. Basically, those are the reasons why. So, why did it happen in Manchester? Okay, it had been producing more goods in an obviously revolutionary manner. There had been an acceleration of economic and social growth based around a capitalist economy. Entrepreneurs were encouraged to invest. Commercial development was not held back by trade guilds and protectionist trade measures. It was a free trade area, Manchester. Always had been. Free trade was allowed between countries without paying tariffs, more so after 1846 with the ending of the laws affecting free trade. And there have been advancements in machine technology, notably water, then steam. Lancashire was an established coal mining region supplying the nearby Manchester factories. There was a large workforce that didn't need specialist training skills to operate the machinery. There was a factory system for the manufacture of goods using the new methods of production. There was the established warehouse system I mentioned earlier, and a trade system via the Manchester to London merchants. That's one of the links I mentioned earlier, which was really, really important. Transport and communication networks were being improved. For example, road improvements, navigable rivers. You could travel from Manchester to the west coast on the Irwell, from opposite Manchester Cathedral, I might add. Blah, 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 blah. There was a national canal system, and by the 1830s, the development of a national railway system. Manchester itself was an inland port due to its canal systems and later the Manchester Ship Canal, but that was after 1894. And that was to cut out the Liverpool merchants and the exorbitant fees they were charging the Manchester merchants, which is where this animosity still exists between Manchester and Liverpool, although it's a lot of banter. But you know, you watch a Liverpool side playing a Manchester side, and the resentment's still there. And I reckon it's due to the Manchester Ship Canal. It pushed the noses out. Lancashire is also in easy reach of established coastal ports on the west coast for importing raw goods and exporting their finished goods, which kept transportation costs down. Now, getting back, again, the Britain as a colonial power is a key in all this. It was expanding its empire. The British and Manchester merchants seized international opportunities to corner a major share of the overseas market for its goods, which, bear in mind, was protected by legislation at home and overseas by the British East India Company, the Navy, and the British Army, and also Britain's allies abroad, which were their own merchants and wealthy people who made a packet from the British Empire at the cost of their own people. Sorry about this. I do not suffer from throatiness tonight. I do, of all nights. And there was a general expansion of trade by Britain during the late 1700s, which was impressive, but trade connected with the blossoming British colonial system and its empire was stupendous. That's not my words, that's Eric Hobsbawm's words, who arguably was and still remains Britain's greatest economic historian, albeit he was a Marxist, so it's claimed, but what he said, what he wrote, was absolutely dead true. The British slave trade was massive, but it was also utilised by the textile industry. So we had an extensive merchant fleet available to manufacturers to import and export from which the manufacturers benefited. The way they did it was empty slave ships from British ports sailed to Africa, for example, loaded slaves for transportation to North America, for example. In return, raw cotton from North America came off the slave-driven cotton plantations. It was loaded on the empty slave ships that returned to Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow, where it was unloaded. The Glasgow ports sent their raw material to the Glasgow cotton textile mills around Paisley in that area. Liverpool sent their stuff out to Lancashire and South Lancashire cotton textile industry, and Bristol did very much the same as well. Came up the country. And in our case, the raw cotton was distributed to the Lancashire cotton textile centres using established transportation routes, which I described earlier. So under the domestic system, all families all members of the family were able to get involved in the production of the textile, the raw textiles that were being sent out under the putting out system. So he had quite a large force, but it was the domestic system. It just went from farm to farm. By the factory system in Lancashire still required a large number of people to work in it. So whole families could be employed in the factory system. It wasn't just a man's domain. Grandma could work there, and grandfather, and mum and dad, and the whole family, kids, starting as early as age 8, you could all get a job in the local mill. And of course, it was the factory system that absolutely transformed the whole of textile manufacturing. and it developed at a rapid pace and eventually dominated the world demand for cotton goods. But as I mentioned, it required a large workforce to sustain it, and sustain it did. By 1860, there were 2,650 cotton mills in Lancashire alone, employing 500,000 people and producing half of the world's cotton requirements. And Oldham became the largest cotton spinning town on the planet, which is something to think about, isn't it, in 1860. Sorry again. Bearing that in mind, though, we shouldn't run away with the idea that the Industrial Revolution was entirely due to cotton. Far from it. That is not correct. That was not the case. However, cotton was undoubtedly the pacemaker for industrial change, leading to Manchester eventually being dubbed as Cottonopolis. It was right at the centre of the cotton trade by the late 1800s. But within a couple of generations, let's say 50 years, cotton had lost its primacy, been overtaken by the growth of other industries, such as heavy and light engineering, which was centred on end coats initially, and the dyeing of cotton, of textiles, that is, the dyeing and chemical industries that developed in and around Clayton and Beswick on the River Medlock. So industrialisation radiated out from Manchester to its satellite towns of Bury, Oldham, Rochdale, Stockport. Sorry about this. Stockport, Stalybridge and Ashton-under-Lyne, where cotton spinning had primacy. But it also radiated out from Bolton, Blackburn, Bacup, Burnley, Preston, Lancaster, where cotton weaving had primacy. And there was a ripple effect radiating out from those large towns to their own satellite villages and hamlets. One such hamlet was Mossley. During the late 1700s, Mossley was an obscure rural hamlet within a larger hamlet named Hart's Head. Both were under the ecclesiastic and civic administration of the long-established town of Ashton-under-Lyne. So, choosing a heading from quite a well-known book, the next paragraph is entitled "In the Beginning," brackets Mossley. So this is where Mossley comes into the frame. Cotton spinning in Mossley was a slow starter, but was present in the area by 1800. There were 4 water power cotton spinning mills on the River Tame at Blackrock. Does everybody know where Blackrock is? Down, coming out to Mossley, down towards Stalybridge, go under the railway bridge. That little area there is Blackrock. But greater events were beginning to unfold when a purpose-built cotton mill was constructed in Top Mossley, and that was Smeeth Meadow Mill in 1813, 2 years before the Battle of Waterloo. That was constructed on Waterton Lane. Gordon?
Yes, I know. I'm in part of the building, Billy.
And it was followed by Valley Mill in 1819, which was at Lane End, Brook Bottom, which is where the traffic lights are in Top Mossley. 2 more mills followed, namely Brook Bottom Mill in 1823 and Andrews Mill in 1824, and added to those were 2 other mills in 1833 and 35 respectively, and Waterton Mill in 1837. Finally, Albion Mill in 1837 was constructed on the site of the present day George Lawton Hall. Those 8 mills were all powered by steam, which was pretty revolutionary, really, because there's plenty of water up there, plenty of water, but they chose steam. However, by 1840, any further industrial development of Mossley's cotton mills and the finishing processes allied to it were undertaken along the valley floor in Bottom Mossley, or along the sides of the brooks that drained into the valley. on the eastern side of the Thames Valley around Micklehurst. So the scene was now set for Mossley's rise as a super cotton textile manufacturing town. And a similar pattern would take place across any East Lancashire, Southeast Lancashire towns. But we mustn't forget Northeast Cheshire in the form of Stalybridge, Duckingfield and Hyde, and Northeast Derbyshire in the form of Glossop and the little places that surround it. They were all part of this cotton textile manufacturing boom. And it was due entirely to private entrepreneurs with finance. To discuss Mossley's 45 mills, at least 45 mills, is far beyond the scope of this essay. So I'll turn straight to John Mayall and his family, who became the undisputed kings of cotton in the town and credited with being responsible for Mossley's rapid rise. But they did have competition from a chap called Robert Buckley and his family, and of course mill owners. But they didn't have the finance or scale of operation that the Mayalls had. So John Mayall was born in 1803 in Saddleworth. He worked as this is most interesting, this, because the alarm bells just ring in my head. Anyway, there we are. He was born in Saddleworth. He worked as a mill hand, eventually raising capital to rent his own mill to produce wool and yarn. And he arrived in Mossley in 1831. So he's, how old is he? 24, is he? Something like that. 28. Whatever. Just as cotton textile manufacturing was taken off in Mossley, he went into partnership with his brother George, and within a few years they bought or rented a number of mills in the town. At this time, Mossley's population was between 1,000 and 2,000. By 1881, the population was 13,850. So you can kind of get the impression of what happened with the Mayalls and what they did in Mossley. So, not wishing to dismiss Mr. Mayall's hard work and determination, it seems his meteoric rise was assisted by the construction of the Manchester and Huddersfield railway line that opened in 1849, which by chance ran straight through land he speculated on when moving to the area. So he's not yet 30. He was a mill hand. He's gone into partnership with his brother. He's bought or rented mills. He's bought land that magically the railway is going to come through. And he's still a young fella, really. Anyway, he sold his land to the railway, and the compensation he received was £16,000 at that time, which in today's money is £1,300,000. Anyway, he loaned that money back to the railway company for 3 years at 5% interest each year, which gave him the capital to launch a rapid period of mill buildings in Mossley. He bought new and improved machinery that enabled greater output and, of course, created more employment. Mayall built Britannia Mills, part of which is still to be seen on Manchester Road opposite Mossley Railway Station, and, of course, the Britannia pub is nestled in there. Sorry, I've lost my spot. He also built the Britannia Mills. That's it. He built the Britannia Mills complex in Mossley, which by 1851, so he came to Mossley in 1831. By 1851, he just built the largest mill of its kind in the world, employing 1,000 people. It was connected to the newly completed Manchester to Huddersfield railway line by its own railway line, leading from Mossley Station, which is where the Mossley Station car park now stands. And it went under a tunnel under Manchester Road, which if you go on the car park, you'll see the tunnel going under the road, but it's been bricked up. And that led straight to Britannia Mill, where raw cotton was delivered and spun, and the spun cotton taken away on the railway. So a rise from rags to riches there, Mr. Mayall. But between 1871 and 1876, he had also a series of mill fires in the town, which was paid out on his insurance. There's only me smiling. There's nobody else suspicious. Sorry, I've always been that way. Of course, Mayo was not alone in his empire building. The Buckley family were also building mills, one of which was Wood End Mills on the banks of the Tame, a section of which remains today. And it was also one of the town's leading employers. Such was the mill building boom in Mossley during the 1850s. Room on the valley floor was becoming somewhat cramped as Mossley made the transition from a village to an industrial town. Now, all was fine until the American Civil War of 1861 that went on until 1865. And you probably recall from your history lessons that the Union forces of the North blockaded the Confederate ports in the South. When this happened, of course, no raw cotton could get out to Lancashire and other places. It had a particularly bad effect on Lancashire. And once the local warehouses had run out of their supply, they had to turn to the Lancashire merchants, the Liverpool merchants for their supplies held in their warehouses. But of course, the Liverpool merchants spotted the opportunity, and what cotton they had in their houses was held back, thus increasing its scarcity and its price. And cotton mills in a lot of southeast Lancashire towns closed, eventually went bankrupt, and people were thrown onto the unemployment. And it was known as the Cotton Famine, which essentially lasted between 1862 and the ending of the American Civil War in 1865. And it affected, as I say, all the cotton producing towns. 60% of Mossley's population was redundant as a result of the American Civil War and the Lancashire Cotton Famine. But they were given work in the form of public projects, such as building part of Mossley Park, which is still, you can still see as you're going up Stamford Road, where you go around the sharp left-hand bend up to the traffic lights. There's a section of woodland and park there. That was built by the redundant cotton operatives. During the period of the Civil War, soup kitchens were opened by and financed by a lot of Mossley's textile barons, cotton barons, as they were in other parts of the southeast Lancashire. Mr. Mayall didn't contribute to it, but a lot of his rivals did. What Mr. Mayall was doing was he instructed an agent to go out to find good quality cotton waste, and his mill never closed, although it was on reduced hours. It never closed, and it managed to produce cotton throughout the period of the Lancashire famine. George Mayall, his brother, built his house, which is it's used by Mossley Town Council now. That big house behind where the Royal Bank of Scotland was, that was George Mayall's place. He built that throughout the period of the cotton famine, and it cost him £60,000 in Victorian money, which at today's value is 7.5 million. And there's people in Mossley starving, and he's building that. Absolutely amazing. By the 1870s, though, although the cotton industry in Lancashire was beginning to recover, it was really a bit of a death knell for Mossley. It was part of the slippery slope of its decline as a cotton textile manufacturing town. Quite honestly, it never really recovered, and it limped through to the end of the 19th century. But by 1902, some of John Mayall's mills had closed following his death in 1876. They just lost control of it all. And by the 1930s, a French company, Mossley Wool Combing and Spinning Company, which some of you may recall, had really opened, and woolen industry started to come back into Mossley. But eventually, the last mill to close was Car Hill Mill, and that closed its doors in 1970, which essentially signalled the end of that period of time. But we should also forget that the same thing that happened here in southeast Lancashire happened in Ireland, right across Ireland, and in Scotland, around the Glasgow region. Everything went down the pan, as it were. And the world wars didn't affect anything particularly, and in effect the cotton industry had gone.
Bill,
So,
can I just give you a time check there? It's 25 past. I don't know how far you are.
right.
And to have time for questions as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
I'll just go through why it failed, if that's okay.
Certainly, do whatever you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why did it go into a decline? There are lots of reasons, and there are just a few here. And they're not in date order, by the way. American and European businessmen visited Lancashire on fact-finding tours, taking stock of the knowledge that was held by the machine operatives and the business management. But there'd been a failure to develop more efficient machinery from as early as 1840 onwards. By 1880, Britain's competitors, France and Germany, had caught up with their own industrial revolutions. They were never behind us in truth anyway. The American Civil War had caused quite a lot of damage with its blockading of the ports. And many textile workers during the Civil War and the cotton famine had actually emigrated to the USA, taking their skills and knowledge with them. Britain had failed to educate to graduate level in key areas of industry and science compared to France and Germany and the USA, so they were way in front of us with developments. And the competence of British management and the superiority of British workers began to be questioned, but that was only towards the end of the 1900s. And Lancashire voluntarily sent skilled workers to the USA to instruct the textile and engineering processes to the Americans, notably to the Fall River area of Massachusetts, which is their equivalent of southeast Lancashire. It was massive cotton production over there. But there'd been a failure to build new mills and improve older ones. British machine designs were copied and improved, notably by the Americans, who introduced ring spinning, which is a continuous process. Once it starts, it doesn't stop. Whereas ours, with our spinning machine, was the mule, which is an intermittent process that worked on a wheel going outwards from the machine and coming back in. Whereas you imagine with the spinning, the ring spinning, it was just a constant process. So it was twice, if not 3 times faster than the one we'd used. And all they'd done was make an improvement on the mule. And they also improved weaving machines, which became automatic. Between 1885 and 1910, there was no improvement in efficiency in Britain. They just stuck with it. If it worked, don't fix it. The old laissez-faire kind of mentality. And more importantly, during this period, India had caught up, America had caught up, and China had caught up as well. And those 3 countries finally overtook Britain and left them dead in the water. And between the First and Second World War, Britain had failed to respond to foreign competition, certainly in areas the cotton, wool, and coal and shipbuilding. So we were well down the ladder, and we'd lost our ability to dominate the world. So they're some of the reasons why the textile industry went down in a long decline. You know, it's done over a long period of time. Other countries had risen. At the end of that section, I was going to go on and talk about the working people and how things felt for them.
How long do you need?
Well, I can go through them rather quickly.
It would be a shame for us not to hear about that when you've done the work on it. I know that if people do have to leave, then, you know, because I know somebody else has got other commitments and they can leave. I have to leave by 6:15.
Oh, won't be that long. I'll just whistle through them if that's okay. Is that okay with everyone? I don't want to.
But yeah, but please, if you've done the work, it'd be nice to share. It's, yeah, don't want you kind of going away. Oh, look, there's a big thumb up somewhere. So yeah, go ahead.
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
Right, okay, I'll crack on. Right, as I was saying earlier, I've always looked at this from the history from the bottom up rather than the top down. So the working people. Throughout the 19th century, the cotton textile owners have been attacked and criticised on a whole range of fronts by their own workers who didn't really have a voice. And if you complained them on too much, you're just dismissed. So you got dismissed from one mill, you go to another mill and try and get a job as a known troublemaker. You got a problem, you got to go to another town. It could be as bad as that. So people kept their mouths shut in a lot of instances. This is before trade unionism came in. But even then, you'd have a problem. One of the main complaints was the 16-hour day working in the mill, and children as young as 8 were able to gain employment, and they were called little scavengers, and they'd jump under the spinning machines as they were going in and out. The frames were going in and out. They'd jump in and pick up all the waste coming off the cotton that was being spun, so that it didn't get entangled with the cotton that was being spun. They kept the machine floor clean, and they were 8 years old and just above. The other great complaint was the treatment of women and children, and there were several factory acts introduced, started in 1802, and the idea was to look after women and children with a series of factory acts. And eventually their working hours were reduced to 10 hours a day for women and children only. And the mill owners, it was discretionary, had to allow the children to go to school. So the children would start work at 6 a.m. They'd stay till 1 p.m, go home, then go to school till 4 p.m. And then they go back to the mill the day after. But because they were so tired, they were falling asleep in the lessons. It was a bit of a complete waste of time, really. But that was the law. But the mill owners found lots of ways around it, so they could abuse it. Health in the workplace. Loss of limbs was really common. Arms particularly, because it was caught in unprotected machinery, conveyor belts, moving machine parts. And there were reports of people getting their hair caught, women getting their hair caught, and young girls in the conveyor belts in the belts driving the machinery, which came from the machine up and over onto a massive driving wheel or shaft that was powered by a machine that you just couldn't stop it really. It had to slow down at its own rate. So if you got your arm or your hair caught in this machine, straight up into the machinery, and the people killed outright, or limbs were ripped off. So there were lots of disabled people working in mills. They did find them jobs, but jobs where they had to be seated, which were the common jobs, which really didn't attract a good wage. But there's all sorts of other problems as well. Breathing difficulties caused by inhaling the fluff flying around in certain parts of the industry. And in the carding room where the cotton was cleaned, the fluff in there was horrendous. And they reckon that life expectancy, if you'd worked in there for a number of years, was around about 40 years of age. And they worked in high temperatures as high as 80 degrees at 90% humidity to keep the air dry, so that the cotton couldn't be spun properly. You hear a lot of stuff about Lancashire had a damp atmosphere, and it kept the cotton stronger. There is, yeah, that is the case, but essentially the process involved high temperature. Social conditions were dreadful. A lot of the housing was built by the mill owners because they wanted the people living on top of the mill, so that they could start work bang on 6 o'clock and worked right their way through till 5:30. So they built their own mill, their own houses. They threw them up literally. I mean, some of the houses in Mossley that were built by the cotton manufacturers there, they'd have stone walls, but maybe a single line of bricks for the dividing walls inside. So you could hear everything that was going on next door again. They were just literally thrown up. One of the other, and sanitary conditions were dreadful. They'd share a common toilet out in the back between rows of houses, and there were so many people living in the rooms in these houses that you might get 50 or 60 people sharing one toilet. I mean, there's only one thing going to happen: it's going to overflow. So they introduced a system of night sanitary workers coming round and emptying the toilets. They weren't like our toilets. They were a great big container that was carried away and dumped somewhere, probably in the river. The night soil removal, it was called. It just didn't work at all. And of course, you end up getting into the water supply. Next thing you've got a cholera outbreak. The other big problem was education. Although you got the Factory Act saying you will be educated, it didn't work. Even though Mossley had got lots of small schools, again built by some of the cotton textile owners, not the males, I might add. And education really came for adults with the concept of the Mechanics Institute, which was, it's not mechanics as we know it, where you open the bonnet on your car and somebody gets underneath and solves the problem within 5 minutes. It's not that kind of mechanicking. It's mechanicking involving the use of machinery. We'd call it engineering today, but they called it mechanics. And it's where adults, men only, it was limited to at one point, where adults could go and receive instruction in their particular job in the mill. And it was a great idea, but the other idea was that the working people should finance the building of it, finance the lecturers to come along and give the lesson, and they just couldn't afford it. So public subscription took over, and that some big-hearted mill owners, not the males, came in and provided a lot of the money for the building of the Mechanics Institute. And Mossley's was on Stamford Road. As you go up the hill, you go around that left-hand bend. There's some new houses there now on the left. The Mechanics Institute stood there. And it eventually, the whole system of Mechanics Institutes failed because of competition from other places, such as the Co-op, which would lend out their halls free of charge. They had a free library. Mechanics Institutes charged money. And eventually an Act of Parliament overtook the Mechanics Institutes, which introduced the concept of technical colleges, and it just fizzled out. And Mossley's went into disuse in the 1960s eventually, and it was eventually knocked down in the 1970s. The other thing, and I'll just mention this very quickly, was the obvious, which was wages. Spinners, that was the top job, that was the plum job. Spinner could earn £2 a week, which is a lot of money. In today's money, it was about 120 quid a week he could earn, but the women weren't allowed to do it. But the other jobs, some of the the really trivial jobs, but when you look at all the jobs together, it made the whole process function. They'd be earning as little as 8 shillings a week, which I've not done the conversion, but if 2 quid was worth 120 quid in modern money, whatever 8 shillings was worth, it's wasn't a great deal. I've got an example of the typical working day there. They basically be out of bed at 5 a.m, start work at 6. If they were late, they'd get locked out, sent home, lose half a day's work, and they got fined 2p into the bargain. And they worked till 5:30 p.m, and they were completely controlled by the bell and a buzzer. A buzzer would sound, they'd stop work, have the breakfast. Buzzer would start, they'd finish the breakfast, go back to the machine. 2 o'clock came or 1 o'clock, buzzer would go, lunchtime, 2 o'clock, buzzer would go, back to work. 5:30 p.m, buzzer would go, finish work, come home, go home, start the whole thing over the next day. I'm sorry, I spent far too long explaining how it all began and some of the dirty tricks that the Brits played on other countries and their own people, I might add. My feeble attempts to explain the problems that the working people had, I failed, but I'm sure you got the gist of it. And I've got a bibliography here of books that were written by the people or by social observers and commentators who were very anti-establishment, anti-boss, and anti what was happening within to the working people. One of them being Friedrich Engels, who you may be aware of, is a big pal of Karl Marx, and they drafted out the Communist Manifesto in Salford. He wrote a book on it, The Conditions of the Working People. It's a great read from 1849, but there are others that bring us right up to date, and you're more than welcome to a copy of those books, and you can still buy them online.
Is that you done, Bill? Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. I don't know what the equivalent is of applause on Zoom when some people are muted and all that, but I'll say thank you to you. Are you happy
Thanks,
to?
Mel. Thanks, everyone.
Lots of thumbs or what have you. Are you happy to take some questions or thoughts or?
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
So
as long as they're not hard. I don't do hard questions.
Does anybody want to?
Bill?
Yeah.
I remember our discussions many years back, and I'm not sure if I'm remembering it correctly or not, but at one stage you mentioned Luddites sort of rehearsing and practicing up by Hartshead Pike.
Yeah.
Was that,
there was
real? Did I remember that right?
Yeah. There was a lot of resentment going on in the industry. Cotton, again, we're talking about cotton textiles, and the Luddites were completely against the introduction of steam power because it weakened their position as handloom weavers, basically, or loom spinners. It completely weakened their position. So what they do, and Mossley, the workers in Mossley did it. Staley Bridge, that was a real hotbed of activity for damaging the machines. And what they do was to take the plugs out of the boilers that powered the steam engines, and the water would run out. They'd take the plug, throw it away. So the machine was completely useless. And they were Luddites, they smashed the machines up as well. But the ones who removed the plugs from the steam engines were a bit brainy, really. Yeah, hence, you sometimes hear the phrase, "Oh, it's a real Luddite." They just smash things up. Didn't have any particular brain power to do something other than. But the ones who removed the plugs were the boys who knew what they were doing, really. And they were actually called the plug riots, which were quite common in Staley Bridge. And the Mossley boys would go over and give them a lift. But it is a fact, the plug riots, they did damage the machines,
But Bill, fascinating talk. I just going on to the things that you said about the reason for the decline of the industry.
Yeah.
I know you gave that really general list, and I know obviously that some bits of the cotton industry in Lancashire survive longer than others.
Yeah.
Was there a particular reason why Mossley's cotton industry was vulnerable relatively early on in the decline? Is there anything you can pin down there?
No, there was nothing you can hang your hats on, really. If you were to research it deeper, and you could get hold of the records, of course, which are held at the Ashton Library, which we've not got access to as far as I'm concerned because of COVID. But if you got in there, you'd probably find far better reasons than I've offered. But with mill fires, and they were really common, there were lots of mills. I kind of hinted somebody being up to no good with the mill fires he suffered. But they were common because of the dry nature of the buildings. You know, they were 80 degrees inside a lot of the rooms, which dried everything out. And a single spark would literally cause a fire somewhere. There was notices all over the place, don't wear clogs. And a lot of the people that were working in those hot temperatures didn't wear clogs because they were iron shod. And in any event, there was that much oil on the floor, they'd slip if they had clogs on, so they worked in bare feet. And the spinners who were on the best money were called the barefoot aristocrats because they earned so much money, but they didn't wear shoes and what have you. But to answer your question, it is a bit clumsy what I explained. But John Mayall died in 1876, and his empire, which was let's say which was Mossley, was handed to his sons, who didn't make a very good job of picking up where Dad left off on his death, and the whole thing just started going down the hill, and it was really difficult to recover from it. And I think Mossley was, I mean, there were plenty of other examples, because it was the 10th largest cotton producing town, cotton producing town in the whole of Britain, really. It was massive what was going on in Mossley, thanks to John Mayall's Britannia Mills. Well, once he'd gone off the scene, it seems he didn't have, there were people not of the same caliber to make the business recover, and there was a massive effect. Plus, a lot of people had left the town and gone to other towns looking for employment during the cotton famine, and they just didn't bother coming back. So there was a shortage of skilled, experienced labour available, which of course would affect output, which affects your profits and what have you.
No, that's great.
Does that go part way to answering your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Really good further insights. Thank you.
Right.
I think that as well, Bill, we spoke about this when we met, but there was that call out, wasn't there, from people in Mossley, the councillors, if you like, inviting investment from people from abroad. So that's when we got what they now called the French firm in Mossley.
Yeah, Mossley Spinning, yeah.
Yeah.
That was DuPont, weren't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah. They traded up until, I think, early 2000s or something.
Well, that family came in around about 1936 and opened up Mossley Spinning. I remember it being on.
My yarn from them.
As you will remember it being there.
Fashion knitwear. I used to buy the wool yarns from them. It's not that long ago.
Right. Well, yeah, there were appeals, and there were appeals for skilled workers as well, because they've been sending workers out to America, to Falls River, and they were there for years. They thought, this is good, it's great, going to America from Mossley. No disrespect to anybody, but they were there for years, a lot of them, and they just didn't bother going back to Mossley, and they were losing skills by the year. So they were advertising to other parts of, locally as well and regionally for skilled hands, and a lot of Irish people came over because the Irish and Scottish industries were going down the pan, as it were. And they thought things might be better in southeast Lancashire, which is why historically Mosley's got quite a high Irish, a lot of Irish families are still here in many cases.
Hey, Bill. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Chris.
Yeah, it was funny. I've just extended my. I'm still in Wood End Mill, so.
All right. Okay.
I've extended my gallery. I don't know if you can see the lovely pitch pine floor in the background. Spent about a week sanding it all down, and it's funny you mentioned about the clog thing. I found in between the floorboards, I found a clog shop, a steel.
Wow.
Sort of mini. I've still got it in there.
Yeah.
It's like mini sort of horseshoe sort of type thing.
Yeah, it'll be off a heel, that.
I didn't find any treasure. Yeah, off a heel, yeah.
Yeah.
Like you said, the amount of oil that's in this pine I've not stained it. The colour is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, they're
So it's,
really rich
really
colour.
nice. But yeah, they're
Well,
absolutely full of oil. So, like I said, when the fires started, it must have started easy because
yeah, well, they weren't
must
up
have been
like
flammable. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, you can see I've done a nice job renovating this old.
Well, you want to be careful there because that oil
Yeah.
that came off the machines was carcinogenic. Once they identified it, they issued the spinners, well, most of the hands, most of the operatives, with like a pair of canvas pants that they'd roll their legs up to the knee, have no shoes on, and they'd have a blue and white pinstripe canvas style shirt. It was quite hard wearing in efforts to not get the oil on through their own clothing and soaking into body parts. So they give them some overalls as like a little uniform. I'm sorry I mentioned that now, Chris.
Wow, I didn't know that. Wow.
What was the oil? What was the oil again?
I don't. It was the oil off the spinning machines. They needed lubricating constantly because they were on for so long, and they'd oil it as you know, like you get a picture of some of the old train engineers oiling the moving parts on the wheels, you know, that drove the wheels. Similar to that, they'd have to oil the moving parts on the machinery because they were moving that fast. Well, the oil they were using was cancer causing. I don't know what it was. I don't know what oil it was.
It's still, you can smell it, obviously. As soon as you come in the mill now, it's very distinctive.
Yeah.
Part of what I like about it is the atmosphere. It's still, you know, it's everywhere. It's
yeah, I'll bet. Yeah, it's quite a distinctive smell, isn't it? Oil. It's pervades, as they say.
Well, I've just Googled it, which is the sort of thing you do when you're on a Zoom. It says something here about this is quite interesting, and actually chimes with something Chris just said. It actually says here, the mill owner experimented with the oil, the unrefined petroleum, by mixing it with, guess what? Sperm oil from sperm whale.
Right, I didn't know that. It wouldn't surprise me though. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
There you go.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Oh, what goes around comes around, I suppose.
Oh dear.
It's degenerated now, hasn't it?
Abuse my here of host. Bill, one of the things that really fascinates me, and I think might fascinate others, is the kind of the connections between people. You know, when you're educated at school, you don't get told about the Industrial Revolution kind of being on the back of another thriving industry elsewhere. You get told it's kind of like, you know, it was Britain was leading the field and we kind of like broke the nut, as it were. But our success, as always, is dependent on other people's success, because none of us work, you know, in isolation, even though we might think we do sometimes.
Yeah.
But what's interesting as well is, like, you know, you mentioned the cotton famine and the fact that the workers were put out of employment, which was, you know, serious in those days.
Yeah.
And also the trouble between kind of like India or the creation of trouble between cotton workers in Lancashire and cotton workers in India. But there's a solidarity at some points as well there, isn't there?
Yeah. The people in the cotton mills were remarkably well informed about what was going on on the Indian subcontinent and how the trade had been taken from them. And I mean, this came at a point in time, you know, in the perhaps mid to late 1900s, certainly 1800s, certainly towards the end of the 1800s, people were really aware of what had gone on in India. And it was partly thanks to a newspaper called the Cotton Factory Times, which was published by the Reporter Group of newspapers, which is still around, I think, with their printing works and publishing works in Ashton-under-Lyne. And it was the chap who owned that, who was right behind the mill, the working people. And the Cotton Factory Times was aimed at the working people. It wasn't very popular with the bosses because it kind of spelt things out and it kept the workers informed. And they really were quite informed about what was going on in other parts of the world, especially America. They advertised job vacancies in it, but it also gave you the progress of the Indian cotton industry coming back. And in one of the books in the bibliography, I think it's the Road to Nab End, it's called. I'm sure it's that one, which was about the Blackburn textile industry. The chap who wrote it worked in a Blackburn spinning mill, and I was just reading the couple of pages from it today, funnily enough, and he was saying how well informed they were about India and what was happening. And he said all the chat in the canteen was roughly like, you imagine it with Brexit, all you hear about these days is Brexit. All you hear about these days is COVID-19. And his complaint was, all you hear about these days is the cotton industry in India making a comeback. It was on that scale. They weren't nasty about it, from what I can gather, I suppose, somewhere. But when Mahatma Gandhi came over to Britain, he went to Oldham essentially because it was the as I mentioned, the largest textile producing town on the planet at one stage, and it still could pull its own weight. And Mr. Gandhi came over and he actually addressed the cotton workers. He didn't want to speak to the bosses. He addressed the cotton workers, and he actually went to Wellington Mill in Greenfield, which is where, is it Morrison's supermarket now stands? And he addressed the workers there from an open top bus, and they were right behind him. You know, these tough women and tough men who were, you know, no nonsense people, spoke the mind, and they weren't idiots. They were well informed, and they thought the man was great. And you know, he was saying to them, you stole our jobs. Not you, your government, your country took our jobs. I want you to give them their jobs back. And they loved him. It's remarkable, isn't it, really? So there was like this affinity. They didn't have any animosity towards him from what he was saying. They really took him to heart. But there would be an affinity between the working people in both countries, yeah, because by virtue of what they were doing. Both shared the same hardships, really. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just think it's for me, this, am I on mute now? For me, from the work we've done so far and that the researchers have done, it's just, to me, it's all about people and the connections between people, whether it's people who are working, migrating, you know, to be part of the industry. Catherine, who I think is on here, is kind of waiting to speak to somebody who came from Italy to work in Mossley.
Right.
You know, we know that people were already involved with the woolen industry centuries before that came from Flanders. So it's the global links that I really like. That, you know, obviously it's a matter of emphasis. Is I'm looking for what I want to see. But yeah, thank you. Yeah,
a lot of Dutch and Flemish people came over because of their skills in dyeing. The dyeing processing of woolen cloth originally, and there were small areas, particularly around Norfolk way. I suppose because it was closer to the continent. Yeah. I don't know. There were little diasporas of people settled. Yeah, and they, you know, relatively.
I think there's a lot of those names I remember at school, like Mayall. I do remember kids at school, Mayalls and. Buckley's still a popular name, isn't it? So I bet you can trace all those sort of names that are still in Mossley, right back to those mill owners and that.
Yeah, and a lot of Irish families as well. You know, they're still here, whose relatives worked in the industry years ago. Yeah.
Any more?
Can I just say something, June?
Yeah, certainly.
Sorry. I was just going to say that our parents came to work in the cotton industry in 60s. And my in-laws, I was just asking my husband, I said, how long your father was working in the cotton mill? He worked at the Ray Mill. There's 3 or 4 mills, Maple Mill. I'm not very familiar because I come from Leicester. And they all worked in the mills. And I was just asking him, and he said, yeah, he's spent all his life from time he came to England till he passed away. He worked in the industry, in cotton industry.
Right.
And it was quite.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Sorry, it's okay. No worries. So, yeah.
It was. If you got a job and you kept your nose clean, as the phrase goes, you didn't cause trouble. Arguably, you could have a job for life, or your working life anyway.
He used, when I got married and I moved to Ashton, he used to work in nights, 12-hour shift, and he worked till he retired. Sadly, he passed away 6-7 years ago, but he always worked in the cotton industry. And my father worked as a machine operator in Leicester in one of the cotton factory there. Right. And it's quite interesting. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's a vast subject, as I've ably demonstrated tonight by rambling on about too much.
No, it's very interesting to know all this because we don't know the history of it because, you know, we are the next generation. But I will talk to my father and tell him about it today. I'll bring him up. And you know, he used to say, you know, like we were in India, and he used to sort of say, "Oh, I got two shillings or something for a week to work so many hours." Yeah. And he used to say, "I bought a chicken, I had a pint of beer, I paid my rent, and I only got about 50 shillings left to last me for the whole next week." Yeah. And we thought, oh my God. And now when you talk about it, that's nothing for, you know, for us at this time, you know.
No, it's true. Well, because it was a unique job working in the cotton industry, because all your family could work there, as I mentioned earlier. You've got grandparents, parents, children, cousins, and a lot of the spinners employed their own children to help them attend to their machines. So they were paying them, and the money was going back into the household. So when you added all those wages up each week, it was a considerable amount of money. Wherein in industries that were in League Division 1 alongside cotton, they were like coal mining. Well, women weren't allowed into coal mining, and hadn't been since something like 1830, 1840. They could work as surface workers, but they couldn't go down the mine as they once did. So it was entirely a male occupation. So arguably, he could have dad and his son or sons working in the mines, which was quite well paid. But that income did not equal the income of a cotton textile family. They were really wealthy in their own, you know, it was all relative, but they were really wealthy compared to, for example, a coal mining family or a quarrying, a chap working in a quarry. Women were quite welcomed in to do a lot of jobs, but not spinning.
Yes. So it's very interesting.
Stole the show.
Yeah, and you know what? Another thing, what my husband used to say, you know, when I got married, they used to do shift works, all the men's, and like say if my father-in-law was working morning shift, he comes back home and his brother will go out to work, and they used to share the house. They used to rent the whole house, and there were about 10, 15 of them living in that house.
Yeah.
And they used to use the same bed, you know, like for each shift. So like one of them got out, the other one comes in, goes to sleep, and then somebody cooks. They have rotas in the house as well.
Yeah. The bed will still be warm.
Yes, because it used to be very cold and the winter was very, very harsh.
Yeah. Overcrowding, that's greedy landlords.
Yeah,
packing as many people in a place as they can.
that's right. Yeah, and they used to say that we used to sleep in the same bed. You know, everybody used to sort of take in turns.
Yeah.
You know, and it must have been horrible.
Yeah.
It must have been really, really hard for them.
Yeah.
You know,
Very
and
unhealthy
especially
as well.
to another country, doesn't know anything about it, coming from the hot climate, where they never seen the snow before in their lives. You know, and it must have been really, really a shock to the system, and to just earn a living and come into this harsh condition.
Yeah, it must have been. Yeah. And the
And-
rain.
Yes. Yes, and it's very interesting. Thank you very much. Really, really.
Thanks.
It was very
Thank you.
challenging.
Yeah.
Bill,
Yeah.
tell us something
Can
about
I just want to say,
Sorry, Champa, go on. I've muted Gordon.
okay. No, it's been very interesting, the whole session, and I was fascinated by it. And I'm going to take it up with the people who has worked in the mills for 40, 50 years. I know for the fact, my brother-in-law who passed away recently, he was so proud that he had a watch which was given to him for his 50-year service in the mill.
Right.
And there are other people in the community whom I've talked with, and I'll take up the story what we have heard about India today and see what light I can throw on it.
Right.
It'll be interesting enough. It was fascinating.
Well, thank you. If you go on the internet,
Thank
you may
you.
know this. You may know this. If you go on the internet, there are lots of articles now by Indian historians about the British in India with the how the British destroyed the Indian subcontinent cotton textile manufacturing industries. It's very interesting.
It is, yeah. I've seen one or two documentaries about having, well, it was all over by the time I was born, but I've seen a lot of documentaries on British Raj in India.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting that what happened there, and all this partition between two countries, and it must have been very, very hard for a lot of people. Must have been very.
It's dreadful.
A lot of people. Yeah, a lot of people.
I'll tell you what it is. It's part of Britain's unwritten history. The recent events in America, Bristol, and what have you, with this new look at slavery.
Yes.
It's going to make Britain sit and think, because you don't learn about you learn a little bit about it in British schools, but you don't learn about anything in depth about the bad things that the British did. You only learn about the good things that the British did, and the Industrial Revolution, and how successful it was, and it made Britain great, and England in particular great. But like the Industrial Revolution, if you take that as an example and you start reading about the successes of the Industrial Revolution, there's not a great deal, and I know this for a fact, there is not a great deal written about the failures of the Industrial Revolution, such as the train crashes, because the owners of the trains and the investors, they were looking for the trains to go faster and faster and faster to get from Manchester to London in a certain time. So much so, which is where our Greenwich Mean Time came from, because of the inception of the railway companies, because they wanted train times to be exactly the same and timetables all over the country. They actually changed the way that we adjusted time to suit the trains and timetables. And it was resulting in horrendous crashes on trains because we were being driven far too fast.
Faster and faster.
And reservoirs, there was a reservoir building period, and to drive the water mills essentially during the 1830s. And the number of reservoirs built in that period that burst, one at Home Firth. Home Firth was wiped out in 1852 because a reservoir burst, because it was built too quickly. It was rushed, they didn't use the right equipment, and it was a complete failure of the Victorian period. And there were loads of them. and there was no legislation.
But you don't hear about that.
No, you don't. It was a failure of the Industrial Revolution. Bridges collapsing. The Tay Bridge, it collapsed because the train was going too fast.
Yes.
Timetables trying to get from A to B, and the bridge hadn't been constructed properly. It collapsed, and the whole train was killed. It's another failure, and it goes on and on and on. Well, you don't hear much about that, only the successes, which is why the British will rewrite their history, because they've got to. The Germans did; they accept it. What happened during their period?
Periods, yeah.
They've come to terms with it and accepted it. The Brits haven't, but they will.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. I muted Gordon?
I'm sorry.
So no, I muted Gordon. You're now free to speak, Gordon. But I wonder if, unless there's something really pressing, I wonder if we could make this a final contribution. But I would, before we do, could I just ask Bill if it would be too much inconvenience for you to put a couple of articles from those Indian authors that you mentioned as a reference that we could go and look at ourselves, or if we just need to search Indian historians. But I'll leave that with you, Bill, and then
no, I'll do that gladly. But I'm pleased to say they are there on the internet. I didn't realise what I was reading because I just skimmed through it some weeks ago. I just skimmed through it, and it was only when I got to the end of a particular article I'd realised it was written by an Indian historian resident in India.
Oh, okay.
But I'll gladly do that. But certainly that biography I mentioned with the history written by from the bottom up, I'll let you have them, Jane. And
well, I've put in the chat that I can send that out to people and they can look at that when they're interested. And unusually, Gordon seems like he might have the final word. Gordon.
Unusual, yeah, go on.
I have such friends. Thank you so much. I was just asking really that we've talked about the massive influx of people into Mossley, the massive influx of loads and loads of mills, and you and I have talked about this in the past many times before. What about the other support services that were going on in Mossley, like the tailors shops and the fish and chip shops, and there was a huge support industry, wasn't there? Here.
Oh, it was massive, yeah.
How many breweries? I mean, it's. I remember you once just listed everything out, and it was a phenomenal support industry.
Yeah. Well, like the houses, they were built near the mills because at lunchtime, the workers, they'd only got an hour and they had to be back in. I mean, they were actually locked in work. The gates were locked when they went in, and they were only opened at certain times to let them out. One of them being lunchtime. So the shops for sandwiches and what have you, or a coffee, were on the same streets where the mill workers lived, so that they could get to the mills on time. And just a short distance away. So there were literally little corner shops completely surrounding the areas of the mills. Yeah, there were all sorts of things. Cloggers, people who made clogs. It was massive. Coopers, people who made barrels, people who shoed horses, people who repaired wicker baskets. They were all based around the mills because they were feeding off the mill workers, of which there were literally hundreds, if any hundreds, in a particular mill.
What would you, at its height of the industrialisation here, what would you say the population of Mossley was at its peak?
I'm sorry, you were breaking up.
What was its?
13, I think.
How big was the population of Mossley?
What did I say? It was around 13,000.
Right.
It fluctuated up and down.
Yeah.
But I think the most I ever got to is about just over 13,000, and I think that was before the American Civil War. But it dropped dramatically, and it didn't recover because once a family left, they'd gone. That was it. In a lot of cases, they'd moved on. So
and it's still not that now. It's not up to that now. It's
8. Is it about 8?
No, I think it's a bit more, Chris. Well, before the new houses that are being built, but I think it was like 12.
Yeah, it's getting on for 12,000.
So even 100 odd years later, we still haven't got back to that level, have we?
No.
No. Glossop's the same.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that's another story there. It's gone bonkers. Yeah.
I finished, Jane.
Okay, Gordon. Right. Well, I mean, unfortunately, the only way I can sort of leave and let you to carry on is to hand over hosts to someone. If you're happy to do that, I can do that. But I do need to leave.
I'm too cold now.
All right. Yeah. And you've got that cast
massive big milk freezing
get
cold
away
now.
with.
What to get rid of.
Right. Thank you so much again, Bill. I know that we'll see you at the Vale soon. And thank you to everyone for your time attending and your contributions and your interest, and lovely to see you.
Thanks everyone.
There's, I don't know if you can see it, Bill, but it's good to have a look at the chat because there's lots of people commenting there and saying thank you.
All right, okay.
So if you, there's a little icon at the bottom of your screen, and if you click on, I think, is it more or something, then chat comes up and you can see it.
All right, okay.
The next talk, which Bill might be there for, is Martin Stimpson, who some of you will know, because of course out of this rich history of working conditions comes a rich history of cultural and traditions, how people spent their leisure time. And so the next talk is by Martin Stimpson, who is a Morris dancer, and that's on the 10th of November. And I will, pardon?
And a paceegger.
And a paceegger, and I will send an invite to you to attend that. And then the one after that is by a woman called Lucy Wright, and she's offering a talk on kind of like, what does she call it? The hidden story of Girls Carnival Morris, another rich tradition of the area, which I don't know anything about, but it's still happening, still alive, still dynamic.
Yeah.
So
be interesting that.
If that's all, do we say goodbye and good night?
Goodbye and good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Bill. That was
Bye,
fantastic.
everybody.